Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The Vietnam War remains one of the most complex, controversial, and emotionally charged conflicts in modern history. Spanning nearly 2 decades, it saw the United States entangled in a brutal and costly struggle in Southeast Asia, leaving deep scars on both the American psyche and Vietnamese society. Even today, historians, veterans, and political analysts continue to debate its true purpose, its execution, and its consequences. Was it purely an ideological battle to contain the spread of communism during the Cold War, or was there a deeper geopolitical and economic agenda? Some argue that U.S. involvement was driven by a domino theory mindset, fearing that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Asia would follow. Others suggest that powerful interests in government and industry, particularly the military-industrial complex, prolonged the war for strategic and financial gain. Beyond the political debates, the Vietnam War was a human tragedy on an enormous scale. Millions of lives were lost, both military and civilian, as villages were bombed, jungles were set ablaze with chemical warfare, and young American soldiers faced a brutal guerrilla enemy in unfamiliar terrain. It was a war fought in the shadows, as much as on the battlefield. Covert operations, psychological warfare, and shifting political alliances shaped the course of events. Meanwhile, back home in the United States, it became the first televised war, exposing the brutal realities of combat to the American public in real time. Widespread anti-war protests, draft resistance, and political scandals led to a deep mistrust of the government and divided the nation in ways that would last for generations. So what really happened in Vietnam? What were the true motives behind U.S. intervention? And why did it spiral into a disaster that ended with helicopters evacuating the last Americans from Saigon? In this video, we'll break down the key events, the political decisions, the battlefield realities, and the long-term impact of the war. From the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the fight for Vietnamese independence to the controversial U.S. withdrawal, we'll separate fact from fiction and uncover the real story behind one of the longest and most bitter conflicts in history. The Vietnam War's origins are deeply rooted in a long history of colonial rule, national resistance, and Cold War geopolitics. For centuries, Vietnam had been shaped by foreign domination, with China ruling over it for nearly 1,000 years before French colonization in the 19th century. Under French rule, Vietnam's economy was restructured to serve the interests of the colonial power, with vast plantations for rubber and rice enriching France, while the Vietnamese people faced widespread poverty, heavy taxation, and forced labor. The colonial administration suppressed dissent, yet nationalist sentiments only grew stronger. By the early 20th century, anti-colonial movements emerged, driven by intellectuals and revolutionaries who sought independence. Among them was Ho Chi Minh, a passionate nationalist who embraced Marxist-Leninist ideology as a means of resistance. Inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, he believed communism provided the best path to national liberation and sought support from the Soviet Union and China. During World War II, when Japan occupied Vietnam, Ho saw an opportunity to strengthen his movement. He founded the Viet Minh, a communist-led resistance group that fought against Japanese forces, and, later, the French. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho declared Vietnam's independence, citing the principles of the American and French revolutions. However, France refused to relinquish control, leading to the First Indochina War, 1946-1954, a brutal conflict between the Viet Minh and French colonial forces. After years of fierce fighting, the war ended with the decisive Viet Minh victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This led to the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and a U.S.-backed government in the south. The agreement called for national elections in 1956 to unify the country, but fearing a communist victory, the U.S. and South Vietnam's leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, refused to hold them. Instead, the U.S. increased military and financial support for the South Vietnamese government, viewing Vietnam as a key battleground in the global fight against communism. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power, implementing land reforms and building a socialist state. As resistance to Diem's authoritarian rule grew, communist insurgents in the south, known as the Viet Cong, began a guerrilla war against his government. In response, the U.S. escalated its involvement, sending military advisors and, by the early 1960s, direct combat forces. The war reached a turning point in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, in which a disputed naval encounter led President Lyndon B. Johnson to secure congressional approval for full-scale military intervention. The following years saw massive bombing campaigns, the deployment of hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, and devastating battles. Yet the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the resilience of North Vietnamese forces made victory elusive. The war also ignited intense opposition at home and abroad, with anti-war protests spreading across the United States as the conflict dragged on. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, facing mounting casualties and declining public support, the U.S. sought a way out through Vietnamization, shifting combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. However, the South remained weak, and after the U.S. withdrew in 1973 following the Paris Peace Accords, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive, capturing Saigon in 1975 and reunifying the country under communist rule. The war left Vietnam devastated, with millions of casualties and lasting economic and environmental damage. For the United States, it was a deeply divisive conflict that reshaped American foreign policy and led to a more cautious approach to military intervention. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to influence global politics, shaping debates on war, ideology, and the cost of intervention in foreign conflicts. After World War II, France attempted to reassert control over Vietnam, but the newly formed Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, launched an armed struggle to achieve independence. This conflict, known as the First Indochina War, 1946-1954, became a brutal guerrilla war, with Vietnamese fighters using hit-and-run tactics against the superior firepower of French forces. The war culminated in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where Viet Minh forces, through strategic warfare and sheer determination, defeated the French military, forcing France to withdraw. This historic victory marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam, but it also set the stage for a new, even deadlier conflict. The Cold War dramatically shaped Vietnam's future. In 1954, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into two separate states at the 17th parallel: North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and backed by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its Western allies. The U.S. viewed this division as a crucial front in the Cold War, fearing that if Vietnam fell to communism, it would trigger a domino effect, causing other Asian nations to follow. This belief, known as the domino theory, became a driving force behind U.S. foreign policy in the region. Determined to prevent a communist takeover, the U.S. began its involvement in Vietnam by sending military advisors and financial aid to the South Vietnamese government. By the late 1950s, American influence in South Vietnam had grown, supporting leaders who were seen as strong anti-communist allies, despite their authoritarian rule. What started as limited assistance soon escalated into a full-scale military commitment, dragging the United States into one of its most controversial and costly wars. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, serving as the catalyst for large-scale U.S. military intervention. At the time, the United States had already been deeply involved in Vietnam through military advisors and covert operations supporting the South Vietnamese government against the communist-led North. However, by mid-1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson faced increasing pressure to take stronger action against North Vietnam, especially as the communist insurgency in the South, known as the Viet Cong, intensified. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer conducting intelligence-gathering operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, reported being fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Maddox returned fire and was soon joined by U.S. aircraft, which damaged several of the attacking boats. This encounter took place amid a series of covert U.S. operations, known as Operation 34A, in which South Vietnamese forces were carrying out raids along the North Vietnamese coast. These raids, though not widely publicized at the time, played a crucial role in escalating tensions, as the North Vietnamese likely saw the Maddox's presence as part of these aggressive actions. With this new authorization, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, a massive bombing campaign that aimed to cripple North Vietnam's infrastructure, supply routes, and war industries. Over the next 3 years, millions of tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam, making it one of the most heavily bombed countries in history. However, despite the sheer scale of destruction, then, on August 4, 1964, reports surfaced of a second attack on the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Operators aboard the ships believed they were under attack in the darkness of night, but the details were unclear. In the chaotic environment, radar blips and sonar contacts may have been misinterpreted, leading to conflicting accounts of whether an attack had actually occurred. Some U.S. officials, including Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, quickly supported the claim that North Vietnam had launched an unprovoked attack, while others in military intelligence expressed doubt. Later declassified documents and testimonies from crew members suggest that this second attack may have been a false alarm, possibly caused by bad weather or misread sonar signals rather than actual enemy fire. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the second attack, President Johnson seized the opportunity to rally support for a stronger military response. In a televised address to the nation on August 4th, he declared that North Vietnam had carried out open aggression on the high seas and called for swift action. Just days later, on August 7, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was overwhelmingly passed by Congress, granting Johnson the authority to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression in Vietnam. This resolution effectively gave the president a blank check to escalate U.S. military involvement without a formal declaration of war. With this new authority, the U.S. moved from an advisory role to full-scale military intervention. By 1965, American ground troops were deployed to Vietnam, and large-scale bombing campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder were launched against North Vietnamese targets. The conflict rapidly intensified, transforming Vietnam from a regional struggle into a major Cold War battleground. Over the next decade, U.S. forces became deeply entrenched in a war that proved far more difficult and costly than anticipated. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution would later be criticized as an example of executive overreach, with many arguing that it was based on questionable evidence. By the early 1970s, amid growing public opposition and congressional scrutiny, the resolution was repealed, but the war had already claimed millions of lives and reshaped U.S. foreign policy. The incident remains one of the most controversial moments in modern American history, illustrating how a disputed military encounter can lead to massive geopolitical consequences. With this new authorization, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, a massive bombing campaign that aimed to cripple North Vietnam's infrastructure, supply routes, and war industries. Over the next 3 years, millions of tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam, making it one of the most heavily bombed countries in history. However, despite the sheer scale of destruction, the campaign failed to break the resolve of the North Vietnamese government or the communist Viet Cong insurgents in South Vietnam. Instead, the relentless airstrikes hardened Vietnamese resistance and led to increased support for the communist cause. On the ground, American troops faced an unfamiliar and brutal type of warfare. Unlike conventional battles of the past, the Vietnam War was fought in dense jungles, swamps, and villages where the enemy was often unseen. The Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla fighters in the South, used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and booby traps to inflict heavy casualties on U.S. forces. They were masters of blending in with local populations, making it nearly impossible for American soldiers to distinguish between civilians and combatants. A key lifeline for the communist forces was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an extensive network of hidden paths, tunnels, and supply routes that stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. Despite heavy U.S. bombing and constant surveillance, the North Vietnamese successfully used this trail to transport weapons, food, and reinforcements to their fighters. For U.S. soldiers, the war was physically and psychologically grueling. The tropical climate brought intense heat, monsoon rains, and diseases like malaria. The dense jungle terrain made movement slow and visibility difficult, forcing American troops to rely on search and destroy missions that often ended in frustration and heavy casualties. Unlike traditional warfare, where battles were fought over clear objectives, Vietnam became a war of attrition, where victory was measured by body counts rather than captured territory. As the war dragged on, it became clear that despite the overwhelming firepower and resources of the U.S. military, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, were not going to surrender easily. The conflict was no longer just a military struggle. It was becoming a test of political willpower and public support back home. As the Vietnam War escalated, the American public's perception of the conflict shifted dramatically, giving rise to one of the most powerful anti-war movements in U.S. history. Initially, the war had broad support, framed by the government as a crucial battle against the spread of communism. However, as the years passed, televised reports of combat, increasing American casualties, and revelations of government deception fueled deep skepticism and anger. The so-called credibility gap widened as people began to doubt the government's official narrative, particularly after events such as the Tet Offensive in 1968, which showed the resilience of North Vietnamese forces despite U.S. claims of progress. College campuses became the epicenter of the anti-war movement, with students leading protests, organizing teach-ins, and demanding an end to U.S. involvement. Young Americans were particularly outraged by the selective service system, which drafted thousands of men, many from working-class and minority communities, while wealthier individuals could often secure college deferments or exemptions. The perception that the draft unfairly targeted the poor while shielding the privileged ignited widespread resistance. Thousands of young men burned their draft cards in acts of defiance, while others fled to Canada or Sweden to escape conscription. Some draft resistors faced imprisonment, while others sought legal loopholes to avoid service. Beyond student activism, a diverse coalition of Americans joined the anti-war movement. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., condemned the war for diverting resources from social programs and disproportionately affecting Black and Latino soldiers. Veterans, many of whom had first-hand experience in Vietnam, played a key role in exposing the horrors of the war. Groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW, organized protests, with former soldiers throwing their medals onto the steps of the U.S. Capitol in a dramatic rejection of the war. Musicians, writers, and artists also contributed to the movement, using their platforms to spread anti-war messages through music, literature, and film. Songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival and Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon became anthems of the era. Public outrage reached new heights after the Kent State Massacre on May 4, 1970, when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. The incident sparked nationwide strikes and intensified opposition to the war. Similarly, the Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that successive administrations had misled the public about the war's progress and the likelihood of victory. The release of these documents further eroded trust in the government and fueled demands for withdrawal. By the early 1970s, opposition to the war had become mainstream, influencing political decisions. Facing mounting protests, media scrutiny, and declining support, President Richard Nixon initiated a policy of Vietnamization, gradually reducing American troop levels while shifting responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. However, the war dragged on until the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, leading to the withdrawal of American forces. 2 years later, in April 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, marking the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The anti-war movement left a profound legacy, reshaping American politics and culture. It contributed to the passage of the War Powers Act of 1973, limiting the president's ability to engage in military conflicts without congressional approval. It also marked a turning point in public trust in the U.S. government, reinforcing skepticism about military interventions and inspiring future generations of activists. The Vietnam War remains a defining chapter in American history, remembered not only for its immense cost in lives, but also for the unprecedented resistance it sparked at home. The role of television and the media in shaping public opinion cannot be overstated. Vietnam was the first war broadcast in near real time to American households, showing graphic images of wounded soldiers, bombed villages, and body bags returning home. Unlike previous conflicts, where news coverage was more controlled, Vietnam's brutal reality was uncensored and unavoidable. Reporters embedded with troops sent home disturbing footage of the war's horrors, including civilian casualties and the difficulties soldiers faced on the ground. As these images filled the evening news, public sentiment began to shift from patriotic duty to disillusionment. A major turning point came in 1971 when the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst. These top-secret government documents revealed that U.S. officials had misled the public about the war for years, exaggerating successes while downplaying failures. The papers exposed that the government had privately known the war was unwinnable, but continued to escalate it anyway. This revelation shattered public trust and further fueled demands for an end to U.S. involvement. Another event that shocked the nation was the My Lai massacre, one of the darkest chapters of the war. On March 16, 1968, a group of U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment entered the village of My Lai under the assumption that it was a Viet Cong stronghold. Instead of engaging enemy forces, the troops rounded up and slaughtered between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly villagers. Many victims were subjected to brutal executions, sexual violence, and torture. The massacre was initially covered up by the military, but in 1969, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story, bringing it to public attention. The horrifying details of American soldiers murdering innocent civilians further turned the tide of opinion against the war. The fact that only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted and served just 3 years under house arrest added to the outrage. The Vietnam War had become more than just a military conflict. It was now a national crisis that divided the country. As protests escalated, violent clashes erupted between demonstrators and law enforcement, most notably at Kent State University in 1970, where National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4. The increasing unrest showed that the war was no longer just being fought in Vietnam. It was tearing apart the United States itself. With mounting pressure from the public, politicians, and even some within the military, the question was no longer whether the U.S. should win the war, but how quickly it could end it. By 1968, the Vietnam War had reached a critical turning point. The conflict, which had already stretched on for years, was increasingly seen as unwinnable. On January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on more than 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam. Known as the Tet Offensive, this assault caught U.S. and South Vietnamese forces off guard. In places like Hue and Saigon, heavy fighting raged for weeks. The most shocking moment came when Viet Cong fighters stormed the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, managing to infiltrate the compound before being repelled. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually regained control of the cities, the psychological impact of the Tet Offensive was devastating. For years, the American public had been told that victory was near, that the enemy was on its last legs. But the sheer scale of the Tet attacks proved otherwise. Even though the U.S. technically won the battles, the American people lost faith in the war. The images of destruction, chaos, and coffins returning home led to growing demands for withdrawal. Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted news anchors in America, declared on national television that the war was unwinnable. President Lyndon B. Johnson, facing intense criticism, announced he would not seek re-election. With Johnson stepping aside, Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968, promising to end the war with peace with honor. His plan, called Vietnamization, aimed to shift the burden of fighting to the South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. However, at the same time, Nixon expanded the war in secret. In 1969 and 1970, he authorized secret bombings and invasions of Cambodia and Laos, aiming to cut off North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When these operations were exposed, they sparked outrage and massive protests back home, deepening the divide over the war. Despite Nixon's efforts to reduce American involvement, fighting continued. It wasn't until 1973 that real progress toward peace was made. On January 27, 1973, after years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, and the release of American POWs. The U.S. had officially ended its direct involvement in Vietnam. However, the conflict was far from over. Without U.S. support, South Vietnam struggled to hold off the North. In March 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion. City after city fell to communist forces. By April 30, 1975, the war reached its dramatic conclusion with the fall of Saigon. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the capital as desperate South Vietnamese civilians and U.S. personnel rushed to evacuate. The world watched as helicopters lifted the last Americans off the roof of the U.S. Embassy, leaving thousands of South Vietnamese allies behind. It was an unmistakable image of defeat. After 2 decades of war, more than 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese had lost their lives. The U.S. had poured billions of dollars into a conflict that ended with the very outcome it had fought to prevent: a unified communist Vietnam. The war left deep scars, not only on Vietnam, but on American society, foreign policy, and military strategy for decades to come. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Vietnam was officially reunified under communist rule. The country was renamed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and the government sought to impose communist policies across both the North and South. However, this transition was anything but smooth. Former South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and intellectuals were sent to brutal re-education camps, where many endured years of harsh treatment, forced labor, and even death. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, known as the Boat People, fled the country, risking their lives to escape persecution and economic collapse. Economically, Vietnam struggled in the aftermath of the war. The infrastructure was devastated, the land was scarred by relentless bombing, and the U.S. trade embargo that followed made recovery even harder. Collectivist economic policies, inspired by Soviet-style communism, led to widespread poverty, famine, and economic stagnation. It wasn't until 1986, with the introduction of the Doi Moi reforms, that Vietnam began transitioning to a more market-oriented economy, paving the way for modernization and economic growth. Today, Vietnam is one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing economies, but the scars of war remain deeply embedded in its history. For the United States, the Vietnam War was a national trauma. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were wounded, both physically and psychologically. Many Vietnam veterans returned home not as heroes, but as outcasts. Unlike previous wars, where returning soldiers were celebrated, Vietnam veterans were often met with hostility or indifference. The war had divided the country so deeply that soldiers were blamed for a conflict they had little control over. PTSD, drug addiction, and homelessness became rampant among veterans, and the U.S. government was slow to provide the care they desperately needed. Beyond the human cost, the war fundamentally reshaped U.S. foreign policy. The American people had lost trust in their leaders after being misled about the war's progress. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed the extent of government deception, fueling public skepticism toward military interventions. This led to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep reluctance to engage in prolonged military conflicts, fearing another unwinnable war. It wasn't until the Gulf War in 1991 that the U.S. finally overcame this hesitation. Globally, the Vietnam War became a cautionary tale about military intervention. It exposed the limits of U.S. power and raised critical questions about when and how countries should involve themselves in foreign conflicts. Despite the lessons learned, history has seen parallels in more recent wars, Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. Like Vietnam, these conflicts were prolonged, costly, and deeply divisive. The question remains, did the U.S. truly learn from Vietnam, or has history repeated itself? The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial and divisive conflicts in modern history. It was a war fought under the banner of stopping communism, yet it ended in defeat for the United States and unification under communist rule. The conflict left a lasting impact on Vietnam, America, and the world. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers lost their lives, the U.S. suffered over 58,000 deaths, and the war shattered public trust in the government. It was a war that changed how America viewed its military interventions, leading to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep hesitation to engage in prolonged, unwinnable conflicts. Looking back, was the war justified? Some argue that the fear of communism was real and that the U.S. had to act to prevent its spread. Others believe it was a costly mistake, driven by flawed policies and political miscalculations. The war proved that military might alone cannot win against an enemy deeply entrenched in their land, their history, and their cause. It also raised critical questions about the role of the media, the power of public opinion, and the cost of war, not just in lives, but in trust, morale, and national unity. What do you think? Was the Vietnam War an unavoidable conflict, or was it a mistake from the start? Let's discuss in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos on Cold War history.